Hi folks, today's literary element is symbol and figurative language. First, I want to ask you a question. What does this mean? Some of you might have said poison, death, associated with pirates, things like that. Now, what this literally comes from is this used to be a symbol that was put on headstones. So it's just a marker, just sort of a decorative marker. But it has become to sort of mean all of these other things to us. What does this mean? Now, literally, this is just a piece of fabric, but symbolically, there are a number of different meanings that it's going to have, and it's going to vary from person to person. Symbols in literature are things that have a literal and a secondary symbolic meaning, and these are things that exist in all of the world. A symbol is anything that represents or stands in for a larger idea or concept, and any person, place, thing, or event can be symbolic. Symbols can have multiple meanings, including both the literal and the figurative. And symbols exist all around the world, so these are these sorts of things that have multiple layers of meaning. And there's also no right or wrong answer when it comes to symbolism. The symbolic meaning that you take away from a story or a symbol in a story is important to your reading, and it's also entirely valid because symbolism is in and of itself interpretive. Literary symbolism is more abstract and interpretive than the symbols out there in our everyday world, like skull and crossbones and a flag. But another way of thinking about symbolism is that it's an element that facilitates further reflection and interpretation. If you think about the symbolism of a rose in A Rose for Emily, that can change the way that you see that story. If you think about the symbolism of the catacombs in Cask of Amontillado, that can change the way that you see the story. And symbols, in a lot of way, can be very important to the interpretive meaning of a story. So when you're considering symbolism, you don't want to go hunting for them. They're not this sort of key that unlocks the truth about a story. Symbols are subject to interpretation, and people can and do disagree about what a particular symbol might mean. So when you're analyzing this, you want to determine what you think the symbolic meaning is. Then, once you determine what you think the symbol means, you want to apply that to the story at large and consider the layers and meaning it might add or signify. So, for example, in A Rose for Emily, if Emily represents the Old South, if she's a symbol of the Old South, and this story is a rose that is paying her tribute, you want to think about what that means, because those are the questions that get you at that deeper level of analysis we're after. Conventional symbols or traditional symbols are things that appear frequently throughout literature, and they have traditional and conventional meaning. Not all symbols are conventional symbols. Conventional symbols are just the ones that we can easily recognize. So they become archetypes, which occur across cultures and traditions. If a story uses a conventional symbol, you want to consider both the traditional symbolism and any new or alternative meaning. And examples would be like a dove, which conventionally symbolizes peace. But if a person in a story uses a dove in an interesting way, then you want to think about both. Another example is a snake. Snake is often symbolically, snakes represent evil or betrayal. You have one in the Cask of Amontillado, and you want to think about how the snake is being used in that story conventionally and whether there's any other meanings you can take away from it as well. Other terms that you'll need to know in terms of symbolic elements are allegory. A common literary form is called the allegory, which is a story that has two connected levels of meaning. A character, symbol, setting, or other story element has two meanings, the obvious one and the abstract one. And a very classic example is the tortoise and the hare. So it has a literal meaning, a race between a bunny and a turtle. But the symbolic meaning, of course, is this slow and steady wins the race. This is more of a metaphor for values that the story portrays. Now, often when you have an allegorical element, they're standing in for more subtle ideas. So this hare in the story is not just a bunny, but he's standing in for the idea of rushing or hubris in a lot of ways. Allegories operate so that the story works, whether you understand the second meaning or not, but the second meaning gives it another layer of substance and interpretation that can be really interesting. A classic example is Avatar. Avatar is often called an all-purpose allegory because there are so many allegorical figures, and the way that you can represent, the way that you process those is going to dictate what you think the message of Avatar is. So, for example, you have this figure of the industrialized military. You have this figure that represents capitalism or corporate greed or business. You have this figure of science and knowledge. The Na'vi are often regarded as an allegorical figure for indigenous or colonized groups, native groups. The Mother Nature or Earth, which is represented in the planet of Pandora. All of these things are allegorical figures in a story, and what you pay attention to, how you perceive them, is going to determine the message. So some people regard Avatar as an environmental allegory that's about saving Mother Earth. Some people regard Avatar as an allegory about colonization, about the dignity of indigenous people. Some people regard Avatar as a story about the battle between money and knowledge, or the battle between peacekeeping and conquering. There are all sorts of different messages depending on how you interpret those allegorical figures. Now, that being said, do you need to be thinking allegorically to appreciate the movie? No, absolutely not. It is entertaining on its own, but there are other layers to consider that we can use to really expand upon and add complexity to your analysis. And these are all examples that come from literature and have been adapted into films. You can have allegories that are historical. So, for example, Animal Farm is an allegory where there's a literal story involving animals, but there's an allegorical story about the Cold War. That's based in historical. Lord of the Rings has multiple allegorical interpretations, but one of them is that the Lord of the Rings is literally about, the hobbits and the One Ring, but the allegorical meaning is that it's allegory of World War II. They stand in for figures of World War II. Those are historical. You can also have a conceptual one. Chronicles of Narnia is the most classic example. This is a biblical allegory, one of the most famous biblical allegories. This is the crucifixion story. Is what Narnia is an allegory for. So Aslan, the lion, in the story is literally a lion, but he's an allegorical figure for Christ. So he has those double meanings. And also, Lord of the Rings is also regarded oftentimes as a Christian allegory with conceptual ideas. So allegories have some sort of message that they want to convey. So a secondary meaning or abstract meaning that they want to convey in addition to their literal one. Then we have myth. Myth is a story that is central to a culture and it embodies the values on which the culture is built. So, for example, creation myths are explanations of how the world came to be, and every culture in the world has one. And there are a lot of similarities between them, but they are also very different. But these are ways that different cultures make sense of their place in the universe, essentially. They are not, now, when we say myth, we don't necessarily mean that they are falsehoods or fairy tales, though they oftentimes are more supernatural stories. But when we say myth, we're simply referring to the stories that are central to a culture's values. And one of them is the famous myth of Narcissus, if you're not familiar with him. Narcissus is a Greek myth where this person, Narcissus, this is him, fell in love with his own reflection. He spotted his reflection in a stream, and he fell in love with his own reflection. And to very oversimplify it, he stared at himself for so long in vanity that he died. Now, this is where the term narcissism comes from, and this also shows up in modern media. This is Narcissus in Disney's Hercules, and in Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy's mother is named Narcissa Malfoy. So that's an allusion to myth here. And what that tells us is that she is, of course, a vain or narcissistic person because she's connected to myth. And these are things that show up in a lot of different ways throughout literature that you'll want to watch out for. Other figures of speech that you want to be paying attention to are also things that have both a literal and symbolic meaning. So figures of speech usually contribute to imagery, which is not just what you see, but it's this sensory component of literature. And we've already explored some of these. We've talked about irony and allegory and myth, but there are additional ones to keep in mind. You have a metaphor, which is a representation of one thing as if it were something else. In A Rose for Emily, she's referred to as a fallen monument. That is a metaphor because she's being represented as something else for symbolic meaning. You can also have an extended metaphor, which also shows up in A Rose for Emily. The house is a metaphor for the Old South, an extended metaphor because it shows up again and again throughout the story. And then the simile. The simile is the exact same thing as a metaphor, except it uses like or as. So she looked bloated like a body long submerged in water. Her eyes looked like two small pieces of coal. This is a simile form, but if it said her eyes were two small pieces of coal, that's a metaphor. A simile is when you say like, when you're just comparing the two. A metaphor is when you say they are two different things. And then an allusion. An allusion with an A in literature is an implied or indirect reference to a person or thing or part of another text. So the difference between an allusion and just a sort of reference is that an allusion is indirect, it's not overt, whereas a reference is directly stated. An allusion is also not further explained in the text. So this means that literary allusions in particular, they can be really tricky unless you have the knowledge to recognize them, right? So if a story references Shakespeare, for example, the Twilight series, a phrase that you'll hear in that series is these violent delights have wicked ends. That is straight out of Shakespeare. That's a Shakespearean allusion. But if you're not familiar with Shakespeare, then that's going to slip right past you. Recognizing allusions, though, in research and in reading can really help add to the layers of the story. But you are familiar with many allusions, right? It was her golden ticket. This is an allusion to Willy Wonka. The ocean was my kryptonite, an allusion to Superman. Or when I crossed the state line, I realized we weren't in Kansas anymore, an allusion to Wizard of Oz. And these add meaning to the story because you can have symbolic or extra layered meaning behind them. Now, in the Velt, we're going to read about two children named Peter and Wendy next week, and that is an allusion to something. You might want to think about what sort of meaning that might have symbolically for the story. But this week we're reading Edwidge Dantico's A Wall of Fire Rising, and you want to be thinking about the different symbolic meanings behind all the various characters, items, and events in the story.